some people, they stop earning altogether and start drawing down their pension assets. For other people who are extremely wealthy, their income, which at this stage is mostly investment income, may well continue to exceed their expenditure into retirement. Taking all things into account, I made the assumption, which I admit is a simplifying assumption and may well be quite wrong. I made the assumption that all pension assets included in wealth would be consumed during the period. Some households would consume more than their pension assets. Other households would consume less, but I'm saying on average, pension assets will be consumed. And therefore, when it came to applying the 21.4% proportion to household wealth, I excluded pension assets. It's a simplifying assumption. And it's one of those areas where if you were to go back into the cave with a more powerful torch and perhaps spend more time in the cave, you could come out with more knowledge and a more accurate answer, right? So what does all this imply? What it implies is that if we forget about the pattern of deaths over the 20 years, if we forget as well about the fact that wealth will almost certainly rise over that period, there's something like 120 billion of the 740 billion in total household wealth available for intergenerational transfer over that 20-year period. When you allow for the time profile of deaths, by which I mean specifically that annual deaths will rise over the period, not very fast, it will rise. There will likely be more deaths in 2036 than in 2017, right? Because of the aging population. So when you allow for that, and when you allow for the fact that wealth will almost certainly rise over the period by an annual average rate of perhaps 2% per annum in real terms, maybe as much as 4% per annum in real terms, what happens is that your estimate of 120 billion goes up to somewhere between 150 and 185 over the 20-year period as a whole, and your estimate of the annual amount starts at about 5.7 billion in 2017 and rises to somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 14 billion by 2036, depending upon how rapidly wealth increases in that time. So we're talking about very, very substantial sums of money. We're talking about huge potential here for philanthropic donations, for charitable bequests, and so on. Okay. Now, the skeptic in me, the self-doubting part of my makeup, will always say at the end of an exercise like this, well, you could be seriously wrong here. Okay, you've put a lot of work into this, you've covered off as much as you can, you've taken on board as much information, as much data as you can, but you have made simplifying assumptions along the way. So, do we have any way of corroborating this number? Do we have any way of checking it? Is there a reality check that we can use to set against the 5.7 billion estimate for 2017? And the answer is, there is, and it comes from CAT receipts, capital acquisition tax receipts. Look at the revenue data for 2017. My estimate is that the aggregate value of inheritance which generated a tax liability A cat liability in 2017 is something just above 3 billion. Why does that 3 billion differ significantly from my 5.7 billion estimate? There are a number of reasons. One is that there are exemptions from CAT, and those exemptions are estimated. We have an estimate for recent years, and that estimate suggests that the value of exemptions is running at something like $1 billion per annum. There are also a lot of inheritances, in fact the majority of inheritances, where no CAT liability arises because the sums involved are below the respective group thresholds. I don't know what the total of that is. I mean, even though, a point that has to be made here is even though that class includes the majority of inheritances, it clearly doesn't include the majority of money inherited, right? But there will be a significant amount there. And finally, there is the issue of evasion and avoidance. So when you take those on board, the difference between my estimate and the estimate that I derived from the revenue figures is not as large, right? It's significantly reduced. But there is still a puzzle here, right? And I haven't resolved it. Perhaps when I, as I say, when I next enter the cave, I will bring more light to bear on this. The bottom line is that whatever the number is, right, even if the number is somewhat smaller than what I'm suggesting, we're still talking about very large numbers. And we're talking about numbers that are going to certainly rise significantly over the next 20 years. And we're talking about significant unexploited potential for charitable bequests, for gifts out of inheritance, and so on, right? So the next question is, briefly, how does Ireland compare in this space? Again, the data aren't great here, right? The data aren't great. The Irish Charities Regulator doesn't even publish an annual figure in relation to total charitable bequests, even though it collects those data. I put it to them a year ago when I was doing this study, why don't you add them up and publish the figure? And they said, well, it actually doesn't fall within our mandate, and we don't have the resources to do it. To add. I mean, what resources do you need to add? I mean, if you can't do it in your head, you can use a calculator. But the point is, and it's extraordinary to think of it, the number is not out there. And so there's a little cottage industry has developed of people who are trying to estimate the number. It would be a completely redundant exercise if the Charities Regulator would just bloody well publish it. Anyway, the estimate is currently running at about 50 million per annum. That is if you exclude the very large one-off contribution made by a very generous woman who died somewhere in the Midlands last year or the year before. I think she left something like 30 million to a range of charities. But excluding her, the number seems to have been running at something like 40 to 50 million per annum for the last several years. That is less than 1% of the estimated transfer of wealth at death. It's only 0.02% of GDP, right? How does that number, how do those proportions stack up against other jurisdictions? The answer is, those numbers stack up more or less in line with a lot of European countries, but well behind the US and the UK, who are the leaders in this field, right, in terms of charitable bequests. Okay? What can we do about it? Presuming we want to do something about it. One of the issues here is taxation, right? And one of the issues is whether liability for inheritance tax falls on the estate or falls on beneficiaries. And actually, given trends in international taxation over the last 10, 20, 30 years, there are very few countries left that tax the estate. But two of them are the US and the UK. And the US and the UK are leaders when it comes to charitable bequests. Why? Well, I would suggest a significant part of the reason is because of the way estates are taxed. You can reduce your estate tax liability by contributing to charities or philanthropies in the US and UK. You can't here, because the estate is not taxed. It's the beneficiaries who are taxed, right? Is there a link between taxation and charitable bequests? The literature would strongly suggest that there is, right? There was a big reform introduced in the UK in 2012, which some of you may be aware of, which, if you like, almost doubled up on the tax relief available to estates that left charitable bequests, provided the bequest amounted to 10% or more of the estate. Did that have an effect? It appears it did have a significant effect. There was a lot of worry in the US when Donald Trump was elected president in the philanthropic sector and the charitable sector, that he was going to deliver on his promise of abolishing estate tax, because people in the charitable and philanthropic sector reckoned that the abolition of estate tax would mean a collapse in charitable bequests, right? So the question is, if you were to design a tax incentive in the Irish case that might encourage giving at the point of death, you can't really design a tax incentive, or it's very difficult to design a tax incentive that will boost charitable bequests. But what you might be able to do is design an incentive that encourages charitable and philanthropic giving on the part of beneficiaries of estates, right? And that was the proposal that the Community Foundation made. And essentially what it amounts to is this, that you get tax relief as a beneficiary, as an inheritor. You get tax relief, euro for euro, on anything that you give to charity out of your inheritance, which effectively means that you increase the relevant group threshold, euro for euro, right? So in the case of a 100,000 charitable donation, for example, out of a 1 million inheritance, where the Group A threshold applies, the threshold which would, actually, has it changed from 320 to 3? No, it's not. It went up from 310 to 320. So this slide is up to date. So the threshold effectively goes from 320 to 420, and your tax liability is reduced by 33,000, right? So effectively, net of the tax relief, the donation of 100,000 is costing you 67,000, and the government is subsidising the contribution to the tune of 33,000. Okay, finally, why should government care? I mean, why should government care about charitable bequests? Why should government encourage charitable bequests? Why should government be concerned about the composition of the income that charities and philanthropies get? It's an interesting question, and I'm not going to go into a detailed answer to it, but let me just put it to you this way, that charities and philanthropies operate best, in my view, in circumstances where there is a balance in their income between short-term and long-term, between big and small contributions, between planned and unplanned. At the moment, the planned large-scale giving in Ireland is underdeveloped. So, because of that, the charitable and philanthropic sector, in my view, is operating suboptimally. And for so long as government recognises the charitable and philanthropic sector as partners in the achievement of social policy objectives, it should be of interest to government that that sector operates as well as it can. The last statement of government policy, incidentally, in this area was 2012, around the time that the Forum on Philanthropy was set up. So 7 years have passed without a restatement. I think it's time that government addressed the issue of where it stands on these matters. And there's a need for review of policy measures. There's also a need for better data. I mean, I referred to the charities regulator. There's also probate office data in the form CA24, which I think could be taken more seriously and more data harvested from it, and that data made available to researchers or published in some shape or form. Okay, on that inspiring note of data, I'll finish. Thank you.
Jim is going to leave us after the coffee break, so won't be around for our question and answer session.
Sorry, what time is the question?
Sorry, it's 12.
12 to. Okay.
Okay, well actually, Jim is going to stay and we'll be available to answer questions then. So we're going to take a coffee break now for 15 minutes, so we'll see you again shortly. Thank you very much.